My name is Rowena Hale, and I turned 70 last spring. People say age makes you invisible, but that morning, as I pinned my silver hair and smoothed the creases of my handmade cornflower blue dress, I still believed my daughter would see me. I'd stitched the dress myself, the same way I once sewed her school costumes, slow, careful, every hem, a quiet prayer for love that would last. The ballroom stood on the edge of Santa Fe, all white adobe walls and desert roses spilling over the stone path. I could smell the lilies before I saw them. The gift box in my hands felt heavier than it should have, 2 crystal glasses engraved with Tamsin and Nolan, May 18. My knees ached, but my heart was light. Inside, the music glowed soft and expensive. Waiters floated between tables of champagne flutes, and laughter shimmered like heat. I spotted her at once, my daughter radiant in ivory satin, her veil pinned with pearls that once belonged to my mother. I lifted a hand. She saw me. For one fragile second, her smile almost held. Then her expression cracked. She stepped back, nose wrinkling. "Mom, what is that smell?" she hissed too loud for whispers. I froze, still holding the box. "You reek of medicine, old woman." Her voice carried past the band through the chandeliers, over every bright bouquet. "Get out, you'll ruin the photos." A wave of murmurs rolled across the tables. Someone dropped a fork. The band stopped mid-note. The air turned thick, perfumed, and cruel. I heard myself inhale, slow and steady. The scent she hated, the menthol from my arthritis balm, rose faintly with it. For a second, I thought I might speak, but words would only feed the silence waiting to devour me. So I smiled instead. My hand barely trembled as I set the box on the nearest table. The ribbon caught the light like a tiny strip of mercy. No one stopped me as I turned away. Not even Nolan. The door's brass handle was cold against my palm, the kind of cold that wakes you up. Outside, the desert wind carried the smell of rain. I stood on the steps, while thunder muttered somewhere beyond the hills, the sky already bruising purple. My breath came slow, measured the way I used to steady, frightened patients before an injection. I told myself I wasn't going to cry. The first drop of rain fell on the lid of the gift box I still saw through the glass door. Someone moved it aside, like clutter. The music started again, muffled by walls too thick for forgiveness. I walked toward the parking lot, the air sharp with the scent of wet dust and sage, and felt the storm gathering above and inside me both. It was there in that quiet thunder that something inside me shifted just enough to make me turn my face toward the wind and keep walking. The rain began before I even reached my car. Big, heavy drops like the sky couldn't hold itself together any better than I could. I unlocked the door and slid behind the wheel, the smell of damp leather and menthol rising together in a way that almost felt comforting. My hands trembled as I tried to steady the keys, but I didn't start the engine. Not yet. Through the windshield, the ballroom lights blurred into soft circles, their reflections running down the glass like tears. I could still see shadows moving inside. Dresses, sweeping cameras, flashing. My daughter smiling again as if nothing had happened. The laughter that escaped through the cracks in the music was faint, but sharp enough to reach me. I rested my palms on the steering wheel and let out a long breath that sounded more like a sigh pulled from years of practice. For most of my life, breathing had been part of my work, steady, patient, measured. I used to tell my hospice patients, "Let the breath go where it wants to go. Don't force it." Tonight it was advice for myself. The rain thickened, hammering against the roof of the car until it became a kind of rhythm. I kept my gaze on the window, half hoping she would notice I was gone. She didn't. A soft tap startled me. I turned and a young waiter in a soaked white shirt stood outside my window holding a plastic cup. His hair clung to his forehead. When I lowered the glass, cool air rushed in with the smell of wet earth. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I thought you might want some water." It was such a small thing, a paper cup in the rain, but it broke something loose inside me. I nodded, took it carefully, and whispered a thank you. I wasn't sure he heard. He smiled just enough to let me know it didn't matter. Then he jogged back through the storm, vanishing into the glow of the building. I held the cup with both hands until the trembling stopped. The water tasted faintly of plastic and kindness. For a while, I just sat there, listening to the rain blur the world. Every droplet against the glass sounded like a question I didn't want to answer. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Softer, smaller, but not broken. The balm on my hands shimmered faintly under the dim dashboard light. I rubbed my fingers together and muttered under my breath, "It's just ointment, not shame." The words came out flat, but steady. Lightning cracked in the distance, a jagged thread over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The brief flash lit the parking lot, silvering every raindrop around me. For an instant, the whole world looked clean washed of perfume pretension and polite cruelty. When the thunder rolled in after it low and sure, I felt something inside me settle. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. Anger takes too much energy. What filled me instead was colder, clearer, a kind of still resolve that I hadn't felt since my husband died. I leaned back in the seat, watching the water trace wild paths down the glass. Each drop carved its own line, then vanished into the next. It made me think of how life does the same thing, how a single cruel sentence can erase decades of love if you let it. Another flash of lightning closer this time. The power in the building flickered, then steadied again. The lights behind the curtained windows glowed like small suns, trying not to die. I watched them shimmer, breathing slowly, until the storm swallowed their edges and the night folded them away. When the rain eased, I started the car. The wipers swept clean arcs across the windshield, clearing the blur, but leaving the streaks behind like proof that it had rained and that I'd stayed. I pulled onto the empty road heading west toward home, while the thunder followed somewhere in the distance, steady as a heartbeat. By the time I reached home, the storm had drifted north, leaving the streets dark and slick. My small adobe house waited like an old friend who never asked questions. I parked beneath the mesquite tree, the smell of wet earth mixing with the faint trace of menthol still clinging to my skin. Inside, the air was warm, scented with eucalyptus and dust, and the faint sweetness of sage I kept drying by the window. I hung the blue dress on the back of a chair. The hem was damp, the fabric heavier than it had been that morning. I pressed my hand against it, smoothing wrinkles that no iron could undo. On the kitchen table sat a small row of thank you cards, some faded, some new, all handwritten in shaky, uneven lines. They came from patients I'd once cared for, or their families. "You made Mom laugh again. Thank you for sitting with Dad that night. You held her hand like she mattered." Each one was proof of a life I'd touched, though none of them had ever made the news or paid much. I rubbed my hands together to warm them, and that familiar scent rose again, camphor menthol, a whisper of clean linen. The balm had been part of my routine for years first, for the arthritis that stiffened my knuckles later, for comfort. Some women wore pearls. I wore this smell. It stayed even after the water washed everything else away. I sat down and opened the small tin I kept on the counter. The label was nearly gone, but I could still make out the faded words, "Soothing Ointment, Santa Fe Apothecary." I'd bought the first jar 30 years ago after my husband Daniel passed. I was 40 then, and I needed work that didn't depend on youth or charm. Hospice care found me the way storms find the desert quietly, and then all at once. I learned early that dying people notice hands before anything else. Hands feed, lift, clean comfort. They see truth in a touch that words can't hide. Every patient I'd ever lost had held my hand before they went. I could still feel them sometimes, their fingers thin and warm, their last gratitude silent, but heavy with meaning. When Tamsin was a girl, she used to beg me to bring home the candies the volunteers left in the break room. She'd sit at the kitchen table coloring while I told her stories about my patients. "You make them feel safe," she said once, mouth full of caramel. I thought she understood what that meant. But years passed. She moved to the city, traded her small kindness for ambition. The world she built for herself was polished and perfumed, all white wine and sharp heels. Somewhere along the way, she decided the scent of care was something to be scrubbed away. I remembered her standing behind me during her dress fitting last month, the tailor adjusting the seams while she watched from the mirror. "Mom," she'd said, wrinkling her nose, "could you not wear that cream today? It sticks to fabric." Her tone was polite, almost careful, the way people talk when they're embarrassed by someone they love. I'd laughed then, making light of it. "The price of old joints, sweetheart." She smiled back, but it was tight around the edges. Now that moment replayed itself in the quiet of my kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like breathing. I opened my hand flat against the table and studied the lines etched there, thin rivers that had carried 40 years of care. They were the hands that soothed fevers, dressed wounds, held the dying, raised a daughter. The smell she despised was the scent of everything that had kept her alive. I closed the ointment tin, wiped my palms on a towel, and turned off the light. The dark felt clean, almost forgiving. In the silence, my fingers still carried that faint, steady fragrance, proof that some things don't wash off, no matter how hard the world tries. The next morning, the sky over Santa Fe was pale and wide, the kind that hides its heat behind a cool face. I woke later than usual, my joints protesting as I reached for my robe. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock, a sound that always made time feel heavier than it was. On the counter sat the unopened ointment tin from the night before, its silver lid catching the light. I made coffee, but it tasted flat, like the morning had forgotten its purpose. The events of the wedding flickered through my head in fragments, her voice cutting through the music, the faces turning the sting of perfume mixed with rain. Every time I thought the memory had dulled, it flared again, raw and bright. By habit, I reached for my handbag to grab a grocery list and noticed how heavy it was. I emptied it on the table, wallet keys, old receipts, a folded brochure from the hospice charity drive. My eyes caught the corner of a cream-colored envelope, creased and faintly smudged. I almost tossed it aside, but then I saw the faint logo printed at the top, Rancho del Sol Ballroom. I froze. It was a copy of the deposit receipt. The date 5 months ago. The name mine. Paid by Rowena Hale. Amount $3,250. The paper shook slightly in my hands. I remembered that afternoon clearly. Tamsin had come by after work, all bright lipstick and tension. She'd said there was a timing mix-up with the venue payments and that she and Nolan were waiting on a transfer from his family's account. "Just a bridge loan, Mom," she'd told me. "A few weeks, and I'll pay you back." I hadn't hesitated. I was proud she'd even asked. It felt like being needed again. I never mentioned it after. The wedding plans moved forward, and her tone toward me softened for a while. She sent me pictures of centerpieces and tasting menus, thanked me for being patient. I thought it meant something, that maybe we were finding our way back. But as I stared at the receipt, another memory surfaced. At the bridal shower, Nolan's mother had raised a glass and said, "We're so grateful the Pierces could cover such a beautiful venue." I'd smiled then, not wanting to embarrass anyone. I thought it was an innocent misunderstanding. Now I knew better. The betrayal wasn't about money. It was the quiet erasure of my place in her story. I slid into the driver's seat of my car a little later, still in my house slippers, the paper clutched tight. I opened the glove box to tuck it away for safekeeping, and out spilled another stack of folded documents, old gas receipts, registration forms, a forgotten pair of reading glasses. Among them, another envelope unsealed. Inside were a few sketches of the venue from when Daniel and I had looked at the property years ago, before we sold part of the land to developers. Back then, it was just desert and promise. I traced Daniel's handwriting in the corner. Lot 12B remains ours. The letters had faded, but the claim was still there. I smiled a little soft sad. The past had a way of leaving breadcrumbs when you least expected it. The wind outside picked up, tossing a swirl of sand across the windshield. I sat there staring at the receipt on the passenger seat. My daughter hadn't just borrowed money. She had rewritten the truth so thoroughly that even I'd started believing her version. The betrayal didn't burn hot, like anger. It settled deep, slow, heavy. The kind of ache that doesn't scream. It hums quietly in your bones. I folded the receipt neatly and slid it back into the envelope, sealing it with my thumb. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, only that I wasn't ready to throw it away. The paper felt alive between my fingers, proof anchor reminder. Outside, the desert wind rattled the mesquite branches, scattering last night's petals across the driveway. I started the car, letting the engine hum fill the silence. The sunlight was already creeping back into the day, sharp and steady, like something determined to be seen again. By late afternoon, the air thickened again, the way it does before desert rain, quiet electric, waiting to break. I was driving along Agua Fria Street, the road shimmering with leftover heat from the morning. The receipt sat folded inside my purse, the edges already soft from my fingers. I hadn't planned on going anywhere in particular, but sometimes the body drives itself when the mind is too full. The first raindrops hit near the bridge. They came hard, fast, each one bursting against the windshield like a tiny confession. I turned on the wipers and slowed down, squinting through the sudden gray blur. The radio crackled between stations until it caught an AM signal, the voice of a local anchor breaking through static. "Thunderstorms moving east through Santa Fe County," he said, his tone oddly calm. Multiple power flickers reported near Cerrillos Road and the old train yard. Utility crews on standby. Power flickers. The phrase hung in my mind. The wipers beat a steady rhythm against the glass as the storm darkened. The road ahead glowed faintly, with reflections of taillights, red streaks in the rain. I thought of the ballroom again, the chandeliers, the blinding white of them, the way they glimmered over every false smile. I imagined them flickering even for a moment, and the silence that would follow. Not destruction, just interruption, enough to let truth breathe. I pulled into a small parking lot near the old grocery store, killed the engine, and sat there listening to the rain drum on the roof. The smell of wet sage filled the air, sharp and alive. My thoughts wandered to a name I hadn't spoken aloud in months, Don Julian Ortiz. He used to volunteer at the hospice where I worked, fixing heaters, rewiring lamps, patching walls that should have been condemned years ago. Don Julian was the kind of man who could make light out of anything, literally and otherwise. He was already in his late 70s back then, hands still steady, eyes that saw more than they ever said. Once during a blackout at the hospice, I found him standing by the fuse box with a flashlight between his teeth, mumbling to himself. "Funny thing about power, Rowena," he said. "People don't notice who keeps it running only when it's gone." I'd laughed at the time thinking he meant the wiring. Now the words felt heavier. I watched the storm through the windshield until the rhythm of it began to calm me. The city lights blinked in the distance, flickering in and out behind curtains of rain. Somewhere inside that storm, the idea took root, not sharp, not vengeful, but clear. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was the weight of truth, the kind that couldn't be hidden under chandeliers or polite lies. The wind picked up, rocking the car gently. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Maybe it was time to visit Don Julian. Maybe he'd still have the patience to explain how circuits breathe and lights obey. Outside, thunder rolled over the low hills, slow and sure, like a heart that refused to quit. I started the engine again and turned toward the direction of the storm. The rain had eased by the time I turned off Agua Fria and followed the narrow lane toward Don Julian's house. His porch light glowed faintly through the drizzle, a small halo against the dusk. It had been years since I last came by, yet everything looked the same: the crooked mailbox, the chilly ristras hanging dry by the door, the faint hum of an old radio inside, playing ranchera songs no one but him still remembered. He opened the door before I could knock. "Rowena Hale," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "You finally remembered the living." I smiled, brushing rain from my sleeves. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here. Where else would I go? The city's getting younger, but someone has to keep the lights on." He motioned me inside. His living room smelled of sawdust and burnt coffee. The place was cluttered in the way only old craftsmen's homes are: blueprints, coils of wire, coffee cans full of screws. Everything layered in quiet history. He waved toward the armchair. "Sit. You look like you've been driving through ghosts." I sank down the cushion, sighing beneath me. "I passed the old ballroom on the way here. Do you remember building it?" He chuckled. "Remember it? Your husband and I spent half a summer sweating over those walls. We wired every socket by hand. He used to say that place would outlive both of us." His expression softened. "Didn't think it'd outlive your patience, too." I hesitated before speaking. "You still have the old plans in the shed." Why I told him about the wedding, about the smell, the words, the look on my daughter's face. He didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly, as if every sentence was a wire he was tracing. When I finished, silence filled the room. "I found a receipt," I said, "for the deposit. In my name. And an old survey Daniel drew up, part of that land was still ours." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. That'd make sense. The developers only leased sections. The back lot stayed private. He studied me a moment longer, seeing what I hadn't said out loud. "You thinking about doing something, Rowena? I don't want to hurt anyone." I answered, quieter than I meant to. "I just want them to remember who helped build the light they stand under." He tapped his thumb against the armrest, thinking. "You know those chandeliers in that ballroom? They run through two separate systems, the main grid and a backup line. If the power cuts for a minute, the generator kicks in automatic. Whole thing reboots itself." I looked at him, heartbeat quickening. And if someone wanted that minute, just one? His eyes twinkled like he'd been waiting for that question. "Depends," he said, grinning, "on who's holding the switch." For a moment, the old radio crackled, filling the silence between us with a low hum. I felt the air shift, something subtle but certain. Not anger, not vengeance. Just the slow click of understanding, like a circuit closing after years left open. He stood reaching for his hat. "Come back tomorrow just after noon. I'll show you the layout. Still have the blueprints somewhere under the mess." I nodded, feeling the steady pulse of rain beginning again outside. The storm had found its way back, and this time I didn't flinch. The next day, the sun returned with a vengeance, bright, hot, and unapologetic. The desert always cleans its wounds faster than people do. I drove toward Rancho del Sol, the same ballroom, where the echoes of humiliation still lingered in my memory. The roads shimmered under the light, and by the time I pulled into the lot, the white stucco walls of the venue looked almost too pure, like they had nothing to hide. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and lilies, the kind that try too hard to cover up time. The front office door was open, and a young man behind the counter looked up from his computer. His nameplate read, Rafi Herrera, Event Manager. He couldn't have been more than 30, maybe younger. His shirt sleeves were rolled up his tie, loose eyes tired in the way of someone who spends more time fixing mistakes that aren't his. Good morning, I began, trying to steady my voice. I'm here about a payment record. Rancho del Sol, the Rivera Pierce wedding. He blinked, recognition dawning slowly. Oh, he said. You're Mrs. Hale, right? His voice softened. I remember you. There was no cruelty in his tone, only discomfort, as if he'd been carrying someone else's guilt. I should have stopped it, he murmured. That scene. I didn't realize you were the depositor until after. You couldn't have known, I said, though. Part of me wanted to ask why no one ever seems to know until afterward. He gestured for me to follow him to a small office. Files lined the walls. Contracts, invoices, event calendars. He sat behind the desk, pulled up the reservation log, and after a few clicks, my name appeared on the screen, just where I remembered it. Initial deposit, $3,250 R. Hale. Looks like your payment covered the venue until the balance was settled, he said quietly. But the credit was reclassified under the Pierce account when the final invoice was closed. It happens sometimes. Guests of the family shared funding, but he hesitated. Not usually without a note or acknowledgement. I smiled faintly. There was no note. Just a daughter trying to start her life looking spotless. Rafi closed the file and leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. You want me to correct the record? No, I said. Not yet. I didn't come to fix names on paper. I came to ask for something else. He frowned slightly, waiting. I know the Pierces are hosting another event here, a thank you dinner this weekend. Yes, he said, glancing at the calendar. Saturday evening. Same ballroom, smaller guest list. I'd like to bring something for it, I continued. A short tribute, just photos, nothing dramatic. A slideshow, maybe a minute long. I was hoping to project it on the back wall between the dinner and the toast. A kind of dedication to my late husband. He helped with the early wiring when the place was built. Rafi studied me carefully, then looked toward the window where the sunlight broke in narrow bars. You're not trying to stir anything, are you? I met his gaze steady. No. I just think memories deserve their own light, especially when people forget who built it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he nodded slowly. I can make that happen, he said. We'll say it's part of the evening's slideshow rotation. I'll give you 10 minutes before the event starts to test the system. Thank you. I said the words heavier than they sounded. He gave a small smile. You know, he said, I've worked here 6 years. Seen families fight, reconcile, pretend, start over. But not many walk in after what you went through. Most never come back. I looked around the office, the plans pinned on the wall, the faint hum of the lights, the space where my name had once meant something. Sometimes coming back is the only way forward, I said. He nodded again, his expression softening. I'll leave a key card at the front desk for you. You can come by early Saturday, before the crowd. I thanked him and walked out into the courtyard. The sky had deepened into that pure New Mexico blue, the kind that feels almost like forgiveness. I stood for a moment in the heat hand tightening around the small envelope in my purse, the one with the old receipt, still folded, still real. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dust, and for the first time since the wedding, I didn't flinch at the brightness. I had a way in now, and this time I would decide what the light revealed. The house felt quieter than usual that night, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The only light came from my laptop screen, casting a pale glow across the kitchen table. Next to it sat a mug of tea, gone cold my glasses, and a small stack of photos I hadn't looked at in years. I started with the easiest one's pictures of Tamsin as a child. There she was at 6, grinning wide, frosting smeared across her chin, holding the birthday cake I'd baked from a boxed mix. Another at 11, standing in her soccer uniform, one sock higher than the other. In every photo, her eyes sparkled with that fierce kind of joy children have before the world teaches them to guard it. I scanned each one, cropped the edges, adjusted the brightness. Her smile glowed again. Next, I opened the folder marked Hale Archive, the one I'd avoided since my husband's death. Inside were the old hospice photos, the ones families had sent me over the years. They showed faces I could barely remember, but feelings I would never forget. A patient laughing under a wool blanket, 2 hands clasped in farewell, a bedside lamp glowing in a darkened room. Daniel's face appeared in one picture, dust on his jeans tool belt, slung low, the afternoon sun cutting across his cheek. He was standing in the half-finished ballroom that would later host our daughter's humiliation. He'd been proud of that job, proud that the wiring was so precise it would outlast the storms. I paused, running my finger over the edge of his face on the screen. "You'd tell me to stay kind," I murmured, "even now." Still, kindness needed a voice, and sometimes it came wrapped in truth. I dragged the clips into Sequence childhood first, then Hale's work, then the hospice images. The transition between them was soft, fading, like breath. I added an audio track, my own voice recorded low and slow, not a speech, just a thought. Love doesn't forget who kept the light on. The words lingered for a moment, clear but gentle. Then came the hard part. I opened the voice memo folder on my phone, scrolling past messages until I found the one I'd hidden under a different name, dress-fitting M4A. It was short, barely a minute. Tamsin's voice light, but edged with mockery, saying, "Mom, you always smell like medicine. Can't you use something normal?" It's embarrassing. I sat still, listening once, twice. The sound cut straight through me. The first time I'd heard it, it felt like being peeled open. Tonight, it just felt distant, an old injury that had already scarred over. I trimmed it down, removing the laughter that followed, leaving only the single line, "You always smell like medicine." Then I faded it into silence before my narration returned steady and unwavering. The transition was surgical, controlled. The point wasn't revenge, it was remembering. For the closing frame, I used the photo from her 5th grade graduation. Tamsin hugging me so tightly, my glasses had slipped sideways. I adjusted the color until the sunlight behind us looked like gold, then typed the final line in white letters across the image. "Thank you for teaching me what love costs." I played the whole video back once. The screen glowed softly in the dark, my voice weaving through the still images like smoke. When it ended, the room was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the laptop fan. I renamed the file Thank You MP4 and saved a backup on a small USB drive, one I'd polished earlier out of habit. The drive was warm between my fingers, lighter than I expected. Outside, a car passed on the wet street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. The light touched my face and was gone again. I sat there for a long time, hands folded over the little silver drive, knowing exactly what it could do and what it couldn't undo. When I finally shut the laptop, the reflection on the dark screen caught my face and held it. Older, steadier, no longer trembling. There was no joy in what I'd made, only calm. The kind that comes when you decide the truth deserves its moment, even if it breaks the silence to get there. Morning came pale and dry, the kind of New Mexico morning that tricks you into thinking nothing bad could ever happen under so much sky. The USB drive sat beside my coffee mug, small and silver, as if waiting for permission to exist. I stared at it for a long time before reaching over and plugging it in again. The file loaded instantly, thank you, MP4. I clicked play not because I needed to, but because I had to know if I could bear it. The first image filled the screen. Tamsin, a child again, her hair messy, frosting on her cheeks, laughing as she reached toward the camera. Then Daniel, sunburned and grinning, caught mid-laugh while measuring the ballroom's early beams. My own voice threaded softly through the images, steady but low. Love doesn't forget who kept the light on. Then came the moment her voice clipped from the recording, soft but sharp. You always smell like medicine. The sound landed differently now. Less like a wound, more like evidence that once I'd loved enough to endure it. The words dissolved into the next frame, my voice returning calm and unbroken. By the end, I felt hollowed out. Not empty, just cleared. My hand hovered over the delete button. For a second, I wanted to press it to end the whole thing before it began. What good could come from exposing pain? But then I realized it wasn't pain anymore. It was record. Proof of love, of work, of memory. A reminder that silence doesn't mean surrender. I closed the laptop and sat still, the morning light pouring across the table. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to stand there in that ballroom again, hearing the hush fall when the lights blinked out. But I didn't imagine her shame. I imagined my stillness, the quiet strength of not needing to speak. I whispered it aloud, testing the words like a vow. I will let truth speak. The phrase fit easily in my mouth like something I'd said all my life without noticing. Later that day, I drove into town. The streets shimmered with heat. People walked slowly, shielding their eyes. In a small boutique near the plaza, I found what I hadn't realized I was looking for, a keychain, brass and slightly tarnished, engraved with the words, "By invitation only." I ran my thumb over the letters, feeling their depth, their certainty. It wasn't about exclusion. It was about choice, who enters, who remains, who earns the right to stay. At the counter, the clerk, a soft-spoken woman with white hair, pulled into a braid, smiled. "That one's special," she said. "It's the last we have." "It's perfect," I replied. Back in my car, I hooked the keychain onto my house keys. The metal caught the sunlight, flashing gold for a moment before settling. When I started the engine, the air hummed with something quiet, but sure, not anticipation, not dread. Just readiness. I didn't need fury. I didn't need to raise my voice. The story would tell itself soon enough, and this time, I would listen in silence. Dusk came slow and amber over the hills, the kind of light that makes every shadow seem softer. I drove toward the small cemetery on the west side of town, the same one where Daniel had been resting for 20 years. The gravel road wound through juniper and sage, their scent carried by a wind that felt older than memory. I parked near the gate and stepped out, my shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The storm clouds were gathering again, heavy and gray, curling over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The horizon flashed now and then, distant lightning too far to hear, yet but near enough to promise. Daniel's headstone stood in its usual silence, worn smooth by the weather. The engraving was simple. Daniel Hale, 1949 to 2005. Builder. Husband, father. I knelt beside it and brushed away the dust that had settled since my last visit. The earth smelled faintly of rain. "I've been meaning to come sooner," I said softly. You'd laugh if you knew what I've been up to." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small bundle of white sage tied neatly with a strip of blue ribbon, the same ribbon I'd used once on Tamsin's hair when she was 5. I placed it at the base of the stone and lit one end with a match. The smoke curled upward, sweet and earthy, rising like a prayer that didn't need words. "I think I'm doing what you would have done." I continued, my voice steady but low. Not to punish her, no. Just to remind her what things cost, what they were built on. A breeze moved through the grass, cool and insistent. Somewhere nearby, a chime rang faintly from another grave. I could almost imagine Daniel's hand resting on my shoulder, his laugh quiet and sure. "Tomorrow," I said, "we'll stop being invisible." I stayed there until the match burned down to my fingers, and the last of the sage smoke drifted east. The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving a thin band of crimson light that made the sky look alive. For a moment, it reminded me of the wiring diagrams Daniel used to draw lines of energy connecting every piece to the next, everything powered by one unseen current. As I stood, thunder rolled across the distance, low and patient. The storm was coming down from the mountains now, the kind that doesn't rush but insists. I gathered my coat tighter and turned back toward the car. The drive home was slow. Streetlights flickered along Agua Fria Street, their glow hazy in the first drops of rain. The world smelled of wet dust and sage, and beneath it all, I caught the faint trace of menthol from my own hands. It no longer felt like something to hide. It was the scent of endurance of all the nights I'd stayed awake holding someone else's pain. When I pulled into my driveway, the wind had picked up. The porch light swayed gently, throwing arcs of light across the adobe walls. I stood there for a long moment, watching the sky split open in white streaks. Lightning flashed behind the mountains, brief but bright enough to make the desert bloom silver. I whispered his name once more before going inside. Then I turned off every lamp in the house, letting the darkness settle complete and clean. By Saturday evening, the sky over Santa Fe had the strange stillness that comes before a storm. The ballroom at Rancho del Sol glowed like a lantern in the dark strings of light along the portico crystal chandeliers blazing overhead and music soft enough to feel expensive. Cars lined the gravel drive black and polished their reflections, trembling in the puddles from the afternoon rain. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and laughter. Waiters moved like clockwork, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that glistened under the lights. The place looked almost unreal, all symmetry and shine, as if every flaw had been edited out of existence. At the center of it all was Tamsin. Her dress shimmered silver beneath the chandeliers, her smile practiced, camera ready. Beside her, Nolan stood with his arm at her waist, greeting guests with the careful charm of a man aware that half the room worked for him. The thank you reception wasn't really for gratitude, it was for exposure. Clients, PR contacts, a local lifestyle magazine. There was even a photographer from the Santa Fe Journal snapping discreet photos of clinking glasses and immaculate smiles. The program schedule lay printed on each table: cocktails, dinner toasts, slideshow presentation. The same word appeared twice on the screen above the stage: gratitude. No one noticed the small figure entering quietly through the side door. Rowena walked with measured steps, her cornflower blue shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. The staff at the entrance barely looked up. She carried herself like she belonged there, which was perhaps why no one stopped her. She moved past the rows of tables toward the back, where Rafi stood near the sound booth. He spotted her and gave a subtle nod. His tie was slightly crooked, his expression tight. "It's all set," he murmured when she reached him. "Your file's cued to play right after the toast. You'll have your minute." "Thank you," Rowena said softly. Are you sure about this? He asked, eyes darting toward the stage. She smiled faintly. Just keep the light steady. He hesitated, then returned the nod. All right. I'll make sure no one touches the console. Near the far wall, a young technician named Micah was adjusting the control board. He wore a headset and kept glancing at the weather feed on his tablet. Outside, thunder rolled again, a long, low growl that rattled the windows. The generator indicator on the console blinked amber warning of potential surges. Power's unstable, he said into his mic. Might need to switch to backup mid-program. Rafi's voice came through the headset, calm but firm. Hold the line. It'll level out. Across the ballroom, the MC tapped the microphone, signaling that dinner was about to begin. The chatter softened. Plates gleamed beneath the candlelight, and the orchestra swelled into a smooth waltz. Rowena took a seat near the back, half hidden behind a column. From there, she could see everything. Her daughter laughing too loudly, the polished forks catching the light, the mirrored walls reflecting a world that didn't include her. She folded her hands in her lap, her new brass keychain resting inside her palm. The words engraved there, by invitation only pressed against her skin like a reminder. At the main table, Tamsin raised her glass, her smile effortless. Tonight, she said, voice carrying through the speakers, we celebrate the people who helped us build something beautiful. Family, friends, colleagues, you've all been part of our story. Her words flowed easily, confident, touching all the right notes. Only Rowena knew which names had been left out. Waiters refilled glasses. The storm outside edged closer, a flash of white cutting briefly across the tall windows. A murmur swept through the guests, half awe, half unease. From the booth, Micah checked the power grid again. The amber light pulsed brighter, once, twice, then steadied. We're good, he said into his headset. Rafi exhaled, glancing toward Rowena. She sat perfectly still, her posture composed, her gaze fixed not on her daughter, but on the chandeliers above each crystal drop, trembling faintly with the vibration of thunder. As applause rippled through the hall, the MC's voice rose again. And now he announced a special presentation, something close to the family's heart. The lights dimmed slightly. The orchestra faded. Somewhere in the dark, a single file waited, silent, patient, ready. Rowena breathed in deeply, the faint scent of sage still clinging to her coat, and let her hands rest calmly in her lap as the first flicker of lightning illuminated the mountains beyond the glass. The chandeliers shimmered like constellations, each crystal catching and multiplying the light. The hum of conversation filled every corner of the ballroom, threaded with laughter that had grown louder as the wine flowed. At the main table, Tamsin leaned into Nolan's shoulder, smiling for the photographer as flashbulbs blinked like tiny storms. The orchestra's violins swelled again, polite, pleasant, forgettable. It was all too perfect, too polished. From her quiet seat near the back, Rowena watched the evening unfold as though she were seeing it through glass. Her own daughter framed in borrowed light, surrounded by people who laughed without ever hearing themselves. The scent of Lily's perfume and champagne mixed into something faintly sweet, faintly false. Across the room, Rafi stood near the console, checking the feed. Micah hovered beside him, frowning at the control panel. Storm's moving right over us, the young technician murmured. Grid's unstable again. Rafi's gaze flicked toward the tall windows. Outside, lightning crawled across the horizon, a web of white that split the mountains in silence. A few guests noticed and clapped, mistaking it for spectacle. Tamsin rose from her chair, lifting her glass. To gratitude, she said brightly, her voice echoing through the speakers. To the people who make dreams possible, to those who believe in us. A low rumble rolled through the floor. The microphones hummed with feedback. And to love, She added, smiling wider, raising her glass higher. Then came the thunder. It hit hard like a door slamming shut. The chandeliers flickered once, then twice, and the room plunged into darkness. Gasps rippled through the guests. A few nervous laughs followed quick and brittle. Silverware clinked against plates. Somewhere a waiter dropped a glass. It shattered loud and sharp in the dark. "Everyone okay?" someone called out. Rows of tiny blue screens lit up as guests unlocked their phones, faces ghostly in the glow. The orchestra had gone silent. Only the storm spoke now. Rain against the windows, the wind moaning faintly through the eaves. Rowena sat perfectly still, her breath slow, her pulse steady. The blackout was almost beautiful, an instant of true quiet stripped of performance. Near the booth, Rafi's voice cut low through the dark. "Micah, give it a second. The backup will catch." Micah's fingers moved fast over the console. Generators cycling. Power should... A hum rose beneath the floor, faint at first, then deepening. The chandeliers quivered back to life, not all at once, but in waves, first one, then another, until light cascaded across the ceiling like dawn. The crowd exhaled, as if released from a held breath. Someone clapped again, joking, "Well, that's one way to keep us awake." Laughter returned, shaky, but eager to forget. The sound system crackled back on. The big screen at the far end of the hall blinked the logo for Rancho del Sol, glowing white against black. A small message appeared in the corner, input source detected. Micah squinted at the console. "That's not the scheduled feed," he said. Rafi leaned closer, frowning. "What do you mean?" "The main playlist froze," Micah replied. "This file it loaded on its own. Says, 'Thank you, MP4. Rafi straightened eyes, flicking toward Rowena across the room. The hum of the generator deepened, almost rhythmic now. The guests, unaware of the quiet tension near the booth, were already settling back into conversation, ready for the next toast, the next course, the next photo. At the main table, Tamsin reached for her glass again, smiling faintly at the crowd. "Well," she said into the microphone, "I suppose even the weather wanted to join our celebration." The words drew a wave of indulgent laughter. It was then that the projector flickered once more. The logo faded. The first image appeared soft golden light over a child's birthday cake, the number 6, in candles frosting uneven and sweet. The laughter died slowly, like air leaving a room. Rowena didn't move. Outside, lightning streaked again, reflecting across the windows. Inside, the hum of the projector filled the silence. The chandeliers steadied their glow, glittering above the guests, each crystal trembling, as though it understood before anyone else what light was about to expose. The first image glowed soft and gold across the ballroom wall, a little girl with frosting on her cheeks, laughing beside a lopsided cake. The sound of the rain outside softened, as if even the storm paused to listen. Conversations faltered. Someone near the front murmured, "Is that her?" The photo faded into another Tamsin again, a few years older, missing a front tooth, holding a jar of wildflowers. Her grin filled the room with a warmth that didn't need apology. Then came a home video clip, slightly grainy. The girl's voice rang out. "Daddy, look at my dress," followed by Daniel's laugh, deep and proud, the kind of sound that anchors a family. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The slideshow unfolded in a rhythm of memory, a younger Rowena holding her daughter's hand outside their first rented house. Tamsin, asleep in her mother's lap, curls, tangled cheek pressed against Rowena's nurse uniform, a photo of Rowena in scrubs smiling faintly beside an elderly woman in a hospice bed. The woman's frail fingers clasped Rowena's like a prayer. Then the voice began. This is what love smells like: menthol patience and sleepless nights. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the hall. Her tone carried no bitterness, only a quiet steadiness that made people sit straighter, look closer. The images kept changing hands, folding blankets, wiping tears, tying aprons, mending dresses. The audience leaned forward, caught between curiosity and shame. Rowena sat still near the back, her shawl pulled loosely around her shoulders. Her face gave nothing away. The next clip appeared without transition, a black and white photo of Daniel, standing half in shadow tools hanging from his belt. The caption appeared beneath him in clean white letters. He built the wires that keep your lights on. The orchestra had stopped playing. The only sound now was the faint hum of the projector and the steady rhythm of rain against glass. Then came the final sequence, short, almost imperceptible at first. A phone icon flashed briefly on the screen, and a voice, tinny but recognizable, broke through. Mom, you always smell like medicine. Can't you use something normal? It's embarrassing. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The sound was casual, careless, the kind of cruelty that only cuts deep when it's small enough to sound like truth. The video held there a still frame of Tamsin's wedding bouquet, white roses against blue silk. The audience went utterly silent. Someone's fork slipped from their fingers and clattered against a plate. Then Rowena's voice returned, softer now, like a benediction. Love doesn't forget who kept the light on. The final image appeared, a close-up of Rowena's hands lined careful, resting on a patient's blanket. The photo lingered for several seconds before fading to black. The chandeliers flickered once more, this time, not from the storm, but from the power of the pause that followed. The projector clicked off. For a moment, no one moved. No whisper, no cough, no attempt to break the silence that had suddenly become sacred. Rowena remained seated, eyes lowered. Rafi, from the corner near the console, looked toward her with something that wasn't pity, but respect. Micah's hands hovered over the controls, unsure if he should even breathe. At the main table, Tamsin's face had gone pale. Her fingers gripped the edge of her napkin until it tore. Nolan said something low, but she didn't respond. The photographer lowered his camera. Then faintly, from somewhere near the center of the room, someone began to clap. Just once, hesitant, unsure whether it was allowed. It didn't spread. It didn't need to. Rowena rose slowly. She didn't look toward her daughter. She didn't need to. The silence was its own verdict, the air thick with recognition of labor, of memory, of truth finally given form. Outside, lightning cracked over the mountains again, its reflection flashing through the glass windows, silvering every tear, every face turned toward the woman who no longer had to explain herself. Tamsin stood, her voice small, trembling. "Mom," she began, but her throat closed on the word. Rowena turned at last. Her expression was calm, almost kind, but distant enough to remind the room who had the power to speak and who no longer did. The chandeliers steadied, the storm rolled closer, and in the bright, unbearable quiet that followed, the daughter's knees buckled beneath the weight of her own echo. The silence broke not with words, but with the sound of a chair scraping across the marble floor. Tamsin stood unsteadily, her face drained of color. The chandelier light seemed too bright against her pale skin. Someone at her table whispered her name, but she didn't respond. Her knees gave way, and the room gasped as she crumpled onto the carpet beside the tablecloth, white roses scattering from her lap like fallen apologies. Nolan was the first to reach her. He dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulder. "Tamsin." Hey, look at me. His voice cracked through the stunned hush. Guests began to stir, the kind of collective movement that always follows shock. A waiter rushed forward with a glass of water. Another fumbled for a phone. The projector still glowed faintly on the far wall, the word "playback complete" hovering like a verdict no one dared read aloud. Rowena rose from her seat with slow precision, the same calm she'd used in hospital wards when others panicked. Her shawl slipped slightly from one shoulder as she adjusted her purse strap. Around her, the air felt charged, half pity, half awe. A woman at a nearby table whispered, "That was her mother," another murmured. "She's the one who paid for the venue." Rowena didn't look back. She stepped carefully between the rows of chairs, her heels soft against the carpet. The orchestra hadn't resumed playing. The only rhythm came from the thunder rolling just beyond the glass walls, slow and deliberate. By the door, Rafi stood waiting. His tie was loosened now, his face pale under the lights. When their eyes met, he didn't speak right away. Then quietly, he said, "That video was mercy." Rowena paused. Her hand tightened briefly around the strap of her purse. "It was the truth," she replied. "The rest is what people choose to hear." He nodded once, solemn. "Still," he said, "you gave her a chance to see herself before the world did worse." She didn't answer, but the faintest flicker of gratitude crossed her eyes, an acknowledgement not of approval, but of understanding. Behind them, the murmur of voices rose and fell, confusion, sympathy, gossip, already forming its first shape. Someone called for water again. Someone else asked to turn off the projector. The chandeliers swayed gently, reflections trembling across the polished floor. Rowena reached the doors just as lightning flashed outside, turning the rain to silver. For an instant, the glass reflected her face, older, lined, but steady. The kind of face that had seen too much to confuse peace with permission. She stepped out under the portico. The rain had softened, falling in thin sheets, cool and clean against the night air. The scent of sage and wet dust rose from the ground, mingling with the faint trace of menthol on her hands. Rafi lingered in the doorway behind her, watching as she walked toward her car. The wind caught her shawl, lifting it like a small blue flame before it settled again over her shoulders. When she reached the driver's seat, she looked once toward the glowing ballroom, its light spilling weakly through the storm. Then she turned the key, the engine starting, with a low hum. Inside, Nolan was still holding Tamsin's hand as someone checked her pulse. The guests whispered in circles, their faces pale beneath the chandelier glow. But outside, Rowena's taillights flickered red against the rain, two small embers fading into the dark. She didn't look back. Not once. The rain had stopped before morning, leaving the streets slick and shining under a quiet sky. Rowena woke early, though she hadn't slept much. The house smelled faintly of coffee and wet adobe. Through the kitchen window, the desert light crept in pale, hesitant, the way it does after a storm. Her phone buzzed on the counter again and again, a steady pulse she chose to ignore. Every few minutes, another message flashed across the screen. "Have you seen this? It's everywhere." They filmed it. She didn't need to look. She already knew. In the distance, a dove cooed from the mesquite tree. The world outside felt clean, untouched by the noise that now swarmed through the city. But even here, the faint hum of it lingered, the digital kind, relentless and fast. She poured herself coffee and carried it to the porch. The morning air was cool enough to sting her lungs a little. She sat down, her old shawl draped around her shoulders, and let the cup warm her hands. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a siren wailed and faded. On her small wooden table lay the newspaper still wrapped in its thin blue sleeve. She didn't open it. The headline wouldn't tell her anything she didn't already understand. That truth, once released, doesn't belong to you anymore. It finds its own path. At 7:30, a car pulled into her driveway. The sound of gravel under tires broke the quiet. She didn't move until she heard the car door shut. "Mrs. Hale," a man's voice called softly. It was Nolan. He stood near the steps, his suit jacket wrinkled, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. The air between them carried that uneasy mix of politeness and pain. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the other chair. She nodded once. He sat exhaling as if it took effort. For a long moment, neither spoke. "They filmed it," he said finally. "Half the guests had their phones out. It's on every feed now. Tamsin's been calling reporters all night, trying to explain, trying to survive it." Rowena didn't look at him. She just watched a drop of water slide down the railing until it fell soundlessly into the dirt. "Then maybe she's learning what silence costs," she said quietly. He swallowed, his voice rough. "She's destroyed Rowena. Humiliated. She says you didn't have to do that." Rowena turned then, meeting his eyes. Her expression was calm, but there was nothing cold in it, only the weight of something long overdue. "I didn't destroy her, Nolan," she said. "I just stopped cleaning up the mess for her." He looked away, jaw tight. "She said you hate her." "I don't," Rowena replied. "But she mistook my silence for guilt, for weakness. And when someone forgets who held the light, sometimes the only way to remind them is to let it go out." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rain and mesquite. Nolan rubbed a hand over his face. "She'll come around," he said, but the words sounded more like a prayer than a certainty. Rowena reached for her coffee, her fingers steady. "If she does," she said softly, "it'll be because she's ready to listen, not because I asked her to." A long pause followed. The sound of the kettle inside began to whistle faintly. Nolan stood uncertain, then nodded once, the kind of gesture that acknowledges defeat and respect in the same breath. "Tell her," Rowena said as he turned to leave, "that love's still here. It just doesn't take orders anymore." He didn't answer. The car door closed, the engine started, and the sound faded down the long dirt road. Rowena stayed where she was, the cup cooling in her hands. A new light had begun to rise over the horizon, not sharp, not loud, just steady. 3 weeks passed before the letter came. It arrived in the late afternoon, tucked between a utility bill and a seed catalog, the envelope thin and familiar. Rowena turned it over in her hands for a long time before opening it. The handwriting, elegant, looping, once so easily recognized, trembled just slightly, like someone had started and stopped too many times. Inside was one sheet of paper and a cashier's check folded neatly. "Mom," it began, "I was cruel because I wanted to be admired. I thought distance made me strong. Now I know it only made me small. You didn't deserve what I said or what I made others believe. The video wasn't punishment, it was clarity. Thank you for letting the world see what I couldn't. I repaid the deposit. It's under your name again. If you're willing, I'd like to see where you worked. Maybe understand what the smell of medicine really meant." Tamsin Rowena read it twice, then laid it on the kitchen table beside the old receipts. The words felt cautious, incomplete, but real. She didn't cry. The tears had been spent long ago. Instead, she made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, letting the quiet settle around her like an old friend who knew how to stay silent. The next morning, she called the hospice center. "There's someone who'd like to volunteer," she said. "I think she's ready to learn what care feels like on the other side." 2 days later, Tamsin arrived. She wore jeans and a plain white shirt, her hair tied back, face bare of the usual careful makeup. Rowena met her at the hospice entrance but didn't touch her, just nodded toward the small courtyard garden. The day was bright sharp with the scent of disinfectant and lavender. Rowena guided her through the hall quietly, introducing her to a few of the nurses, then left her in the hands of Maria, the volunteer coordinator. "One shift," Rowena said. "Let the place speak for itself." When the shift ended, Tamsin stepped outside looking both older and younger. She didn't say much, only, "It's quieter than I thought. That's because peace doesn't shout," Rowena replied. That evening, when Tamsin appeared at her mother's porch, Rowena didn't seem surprised. She opened the door halfway, just enough for the light to fall between them. "I brought tea," Tamsin said softly, holding up a small paper bag. Rowena hesitated, then nodded once. "You can come in." The kitchen felt the same as it always had, warm, worn humming, faintly with the kettle on the stove. They sat across from each other, the air between them filled not with apologies, but the faint clink of cups and the rustle of steam. Tamsin reached for her mug, but didn't lift it. Her hands were still. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Then don't," Rowena answered. "Just start showing me." Outside, the last light of evening touched the porch railing, soft and amber. Inside, the silence no longer hurt. It simply waited, like a door unlocked, but not yet wide open. Evening came slow and gold over Santa Fe, the kind of light that makes everything honest. The mountains glowed faintly in the distance, and the air carried that clean edge of early summer dust, chilly in memory. Rowena stood on her porch, with the watering can in hand, tilting it gently over the row of chili plants that lined the railing. Drops fell steady, small arcs, catching the last sunlight before disappearing into the soil. The porch boards creaked softly beneath her feet. Beside the door, the new brass plaque gleamed in the low light. "Home by invitation only." The engraving caught the sun for a heartbeat, then dimmed as the shadows stretched across the yard. She had polished it herself that morning, not out of pride, but out of ritual. Some things deserved to shine even quietly. Inside the house was calm. The windows were open just enough to let the wind move through, rustling the curtains like a sigh. On the kitchen table sat a sealed envelope, cream-colored careful handwriting across the front. "Mom," it read. "No return address, no urgency. Just patience." Rowena hadn't opened it yet. She would someday, when the silence around her didn't feel so peaceful. The phone had stopped ringing as often. The world, after its brief fever of curiosity, had moved on. People found new scandals to feed on new lessons to forget. The story that once devoured her name had turned into something smaller, an anecdote, a caution, a whisper. And that was fine. She poured the last of the water into the pot nearest the step where the soil stayed dry longest. The sky had gone lavender, now the horizon split by thin streaks of gold. Across the road, someone's radio played a slow bolero crackling through static. When she sat down in her old wicker chair, the wood groaned in familiar rhythm. Her knees ached, but gently, the way old things do when they've earned the right to slow down. She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap, the faint scent of menthol still clinging to her skin. She thought briefly of Tamsin at the hospice, of the way her daughter had knelt beside a patient's bed, uncertain but trying. The image wasn't heavy, it didn't ache anymore. It simply existed, like a seed that might one day grow without being asked. On the far side of the yard, the motion light flickered to life as dusk deepened. It glowed softly over the porch steps, haloing the brass plaque in warm light. Rowena smiled at the sight of it. The light had been Daniel's idea long ago, meant to guide visitors in the dark. Now it guided something else entirely. She looked toward the unopened letter once more through the window. Not yet, she thought. Peace wasn't about rushing to reconcile. It was about knowing when the silence had said enough. The wind shifted, brushing the loose ends of her shawl against her wrist. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of rain far off in the hills. Freedom isn't given, she murmured to herself. It's practiced, one boundary at a time. The porch light held steady, unwavering, casting its circle of warmth into the twilight as the first stars began to appear above the desert ridge.